When we evaluate human intelligence, we tend to focus exclusively on constructive progress.
Right, like building things or solving equations.
Exactly. We look at the person who, I don't know, studies higher mathematics or engineers a suspension bridge, and we view those actions as the absolute pinnacle of cognitive achievement.
Yeah, society treats them as these markers of a highly evolved brain.
Yeah. But if you look at another universal human behavior, something that literally every single person listening to this right now engages in, the applause just vanishes.
It completely disappears.
Right. We treat it as a moral failing, like a glitch in the programming.
Well, yeah, it's treated as this aberration, right? Something outside the bounds of proper social functioning. Yet, from a purely neurological and evolutionary standpoint, it requires just a staggering amount of cognitive horsepower.
I am talking about lying, and our mission for today's deep dive is to unpack a profoundly dense, multidisciplinary text that, honestly, it forces a complete reevaluation of deception.
It really does.
We are diving into the Oxford Handbook of Lying, which was edited by Jörg Maybauer back in 2019. And I want to be clear right up front, this isn't just some superficial look at the ethics of fibbing.
No, not at all. The scope is massive.
It is. We are pulling from philosophy, linguistics, evolutionary biology, developmental psychology, and neuroscience, all to understand the hidden architecture of deception.
And the core provocation we're exploring today, which I think is so fascinating, is that lying is not a cognitive shortcut.
Right.
It's actually one of the highest achievements of the human brain.
Yeah.
It's on par with abstract reasoning. And far from being a glitch, evolution specifically favored the deceptive.
Which is such a crazy paradigm shift.
It's essential, though, before we even delve into the chapters, because whether you are, observing the manipulations in a Shakespearean tragedy like Othello, or just analyzing everyday interactions at the office, lying is ubiquitous.
It's everywhere.
Yeah. And the handbook really demonstrates that deception requires immense cognitive control and this deeply intricate understanding of social reality. So it's a feature, a highly optimized function of the mind.
So before we can map out how evolution rewarded this behavior or, how the prefrontal cortex processes it, we have to isolate what lie actually is.
Which is harder than it sounds.
Way harder. Parsing through the early chapters, especially the philosophical frameworks, it becomes immediately clear that the standard dictionary definition just completely fails to capture the mechanics.
Yeah, the dictionary usually defines a lie as an untrue statement made with the intent to deceive.
Right. But philosopher Thomas L. Carson, whose work is heavily featured in this text, he just tears that definition apart.
He does. Carson identifies a fundamental flaw in tying the definition of a lie to objective truth. He argues that a lie does not have to be objectively false. It merely has to be a believed false statement.
A believed false statement.
Exactly. The objective reality of the universe is actually irrelevant to the speech act of lying.
Okay, let's unpack this because the concept of epistemic luck really clarified it for me.
Oh, the rain example.
Yes. Okay, so suppose you are looking out your window and you see heavy rain. I am in another room and I ask you about the weather. Now, you want me to go outside and get drenched.
Because I'm a terrible friend.
Right. Terrible friend. So you tell me, oh, it's completely clear and sunny. But in the 3 seconds between you looking out the window and answering me, the storm breaks and the sun comes out.
So my statement is factually accurate.
Exactly. Your statement, it is sunny, is 100% factually true. Yet under Carson's framework, you still lied.
You lied because the action of lying occurs in the intent and the belief of the speaker, right?
Yeah.
Not in the external verification of the facts.
Yeah.
Your internal model of the world was, it is raining, and you deliberately communicated the inverse of that internal model.
That makes so much sense.
And this is where the linguistic perspective becomes really critical. In Chapter 8, Mark Jerry explores the philosopher Robert Stalnaker's model of assertion.
Oh, this was brilliant.
Yeah, it shifts the focus from objective truth to what Stalnaker calls the common ground.
I honestly found Stalnaker's model to be one of the most useful mental frameworks in the entire handbook. Like, if we view a conversation not just as an exchange of sounds, but as two nodes sharing a dynamic, updating dataset,
Right.
that dataset is the common ground. It's the mutual reality we agree upon to make communication even possible.
And that shared dataset is built through assertions.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you make an assertion, you are officially proposing that a new piece of information be added to the common ground.
Okay.
If the listener accepts it, the shared reality updates. What makes lying so distinct linguistically is that the speaker is attempting to add a proposition to the common ground that they themselves do not hold in their internal data set.
Oh, wow. So they are basically weaponizing the mechanism of assertion.
Exactly. They're feeding corrupted data into the shared drive.
Montaigne actually captured this perfectly. There's a quote in the text where he says, the opposite of truth has many shapes and an indefinite field.
That's a great quote.
To understand those shapes, we have to look at the rules of the field itself. The linguist Paul Grice outlined the cooperative principle, which dictates that human communication only functions because we operate on a baseline assumption of truthfulness.
Right, his maxim of quality.
Yeah, which essentially states, do not say what you believe to be false. Therefore, a lie is a calculated parasitic exploitation of that baseline assumption.
The term parasitic is so apt there because deception only works because the host organism.
The system of language.
Exactly. The overarching system of language is overwhelmingly truthful. If Grice's cooperative principle didn't exist, like if we assumed everyone was constantly feeding false data into the common ground, lying would lose all its power.
But let's test the boundaries of Stalnaker and Grice here. Because if we define a lie purely as a believed false statement that violates the common ground, we run into a major categorization problem.
You mean with humor and things like that?
Yeah, exactly. If I use heavy sarcasm, or if a comedian tells a clearly fabricated story on stage, they are transmitting believed false statements, right?
Technically, yes.
They are deliberately departing from objective reality, yet we don't classify them as liars. So how does the linguistic framework separate the malicious liar from the comedian?
Well, Carol J. Hardin addresses this exact boundary in Chapter 4. The distinction relies entirely on implicit assumptions derived from social and cultural contexts.
Okay, so the context shifts the rules.
Right. The common ground is not just the literal word spoken. It includes the shared awareness of the environment. When a comedian is on stage, the context signals an overarching rule change.
So everyone is in on it.
Yeah, the implicit agreement between the speaker and the listener updates to acknowledge that the literal truth is suspended.
So the speaker knows that the listener knows that the statement is false. It's a mutually transparent game.
Exactly. Whereas a true lie requires an asymmetry of awareness. The listener must be unaware that the game is being played.
Got it. And that asymmetry is usually driven by the intent to deceive. However, that brings us to one of the most heavily debated concepts in the philosophy of language, which is detailed across chapters 11, 18, and 19.
The bald-faced lie.
The bald-faced lie. It just shatters that entire framework of asymmetric awareness. The Handbook uses this brilliant thought experiment that mirrors real-world behavior perfectly.
The broken window.
Yes. Imagine a group of young adults who deliberately throw a rock through a store window. The police arrive immediately. The kids are standing next to the shattered glass, literally holding rocks.
Caught red-handed.
Totally. The police officer asks, "Did you break this window?" And the kids look the officer dead in the eye and say, "We didn't break anything. What broken window?"
Which forces a massive philosophical crisis.
Right.
Because in this scenario, the teenagers know the police won't be deceived.
Right.
The police know the teenagers are guilty. Furthermore, the teenagers know that the police know they are lying.
The asymmetry is completely gone.
Completely. There is absolutely zero intent to deceive, because deception is practically impossible in that moment.
And yet, if you ask anyone on the street, they will categorize the statement, "We didn't break anything," as a lie.
Oh, without hesitation.
Right. And this is the battleground between the deceptionists and the non-deceptionists. The deceptionists insist that for a speech act to be a lie, there must be an intent to deceive the listener.
But the non-deceptionists use the bold-faced lie to prove that intent is not a mandatory condition.
How do they justify that?
Well, the non-deceptionists argue that the defining characteristic of a lie is making a believed false statement in a context where truth is conventionally expected.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the police interrogation is a formal context demanding the truth. By stating a falsehood on the record, even with zero hope of actually deceiving the officer, the teenagers are still lying. They are refusing to officially add their guilt to Stalnaker's common ground.
Philosopher Jennifer Lackey offers a synthesis in the text that I think resolves this tension so elegantly. She separates the concept of deceit from deception.
Which we usually just use interchangeably.
Exactly. We tend to mix them up, but Lackey draws a really sharp operational boundary between them.
She defines deceit as the active attempt to bring about a false belief in another person. That is what fails in the bold-faced lie. The kids cannot bring about a false belief in the police officer.
Because the officer is literally looking at the rocks.
Right. But deception, she argues, is broader. Deception includes the aim to conceal information.
To clarify Lackey's distinction for anyone listening, consider the scenario from the source, kind of adapt it a bit. Let's say you're getting ready to sell a used car and you know the transmission is failing.
Okay.
If a buyer comes to look at the car and they never ask about the transmission and you never bring it up, you are withholding. You're exploiting their lack of inquiry.
Right. You are failing to volunteer the data, but you're not actually constructing a false reality.
Right. But if you know the buyer is coming, and you intentionally pour a heavy additive into the transmission fluid specifically to mask the grinding noise for the test drive, that is active concealment.
That's a great distinction.
Even if the buyer is a mechanic who immediately realizes what you did and is not actually deceived into a false belief, your action of altering the engine to hide the flaw is an act of deception.
Yeah, and the teenagers with the broken window are doing the exact same thing, just verbally. They're putting up a linguistic wall to conceal their formal admission of guilt, even if they fail to cause deceit.
So lying, deceit, and deception are not perfectly overlapping circles.
No, not at all. They form this highly nuanced Venn diagram where intent, conventional context, and the manipulation of evidence all interact.
And this distinction between bringing about a false belief versus concealing information, it forces us to look at the mechanics of omission. Because if we step away from the blatant, bald-faced lie, we enter a much murkier territory.
Where language is used not to flip a belief from true to false, but merely to degrade the listener's certainty.
Yes, exactly. Neri Marsili explores this in Chapter 12.
Marsili challenges the binary view of human belief. We don't just hold propositions as 100% true or 100% false. Our epistemology operates on degrees of certainty.
Right, like a sliding scale.
Yeah. Lying, therefore, is often calibrated not to create an absolute false belief, but to strategically alter those degrees of certainty.
The text discusses the knowledge lie, or calumny, which is so incredibly relevant when you observe modern political discourse. And, just to be clear for the listener, we are merely examining the philosophical mechanisms detailed in the handbook here. We're not commenting on any specific political ideology or endorsing any sides.
Absolutely. We are strictly looking at the operational mechanics.
Right. But Marsili uses the example of a calculated false accusation leveled at a political rival right before an election.
And the strategic logic of calumny is fascinating, because the speaker making the false accusation might know with absolute certainty that independent media will fact-check the claim, find the objective truth, and broadcast the correction within hours.
So the deceit has a mathematically limited lifespan.
Exactly.
So why expend the cognitive effort to tell a lie that you know will be publicly dismantled almost immediately?
Well, the brilliance and really the danger of Marsili's framework is that the lie doesn't need to survive the fact check to be successful.
Oh, wow.
The goal is epistemic damage. Even after you read the correction, your degree of certainty regarding the rival's innocence has been degraded. You might think, well, the specific accusation was false, but where there is smoke, there is fire.
So the assertion altered the common ground just enough to inject doubt.
Yes, and this is fundamentally linked to Don Fallis's analysis of omissions in Chapter 13. When we withhold information, we allow that degraded certainty to fester.
So if someone operates under a misconception that benefits you and you choose not to correct it, Fallis argues you are actively managing their epistemic state.
You're pulling the strings of their reality without making a formal assertion.
And this sliding scale, from the bald-faced assertion to the injection of doubt down to the strategic omission, it creates a massive headache for the legal system.
Oh, a huge headache. Stuart P. Green's work in Chapter 37 highlights the severe dichotomy in how society regulates deception.
Right, because the law is incredibly tolerant of omissions. In contract law, the doctrine of caveat emptor, buyer beware, it often allows negotiators to legally withhold critical information about their bottom line or their alternatives.
And the Fifth Amendment constitutionally protects the ultimate omission, right? The right to remain silent.
Yes. Yet the law ruthlessly punishes the act of lie. Perjury, fraud, false statements to federal investigators, they all carry severe prison sentences. The legal framework creates this massive chasm between passive withholding and active assertion.
It's a huge disparity.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me. If the moral outcome is identical, like in both cases, you have a listener whose internal reality has been manipulated to their detriment. So how does the legal philosophy justify treating the act of lie so much more harshly than the deceptive silence?
Green points back to the linguistic foundations we discussed earlier with Grice and Stallnaker. An active lie is a verifiable assertion that is literally false.
Okay.
By making an assertion, you are actively utilizing the cooperative tools of human communication. You're invoking the social contract of trust to deliver a payload of falsehood.
Wow, so you're weaponizing the system itself.
The law punishes the active lie so severely because it subverts the very infrastructure of society.
So you are basically poisoning the communal well, whereas an omission is simply watching someone drink from a puddle when you have a map to the well.
That is exactly the philosophical consensus. We have a much higher legal and ethical duty not to actively break the mechanism of truth than we do to continuously supply everyone around us with perfect information.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've spent a lot of time mapping the philosophy, the linguistics, and the law, and we've established that lying requires this incredibly complex manipulation of intent, common ground, and degrees of certainty.
It's extremely complex.
It feels like a distinctly, uniquely human achievement, but the handbook refuses to let us keep that anthropocentric view. Chapter 6 completely upends the timeline.
By looking at the evolutionary biology of deception.
Yes. And the most startling revelation, at least for me, is that you do not need a central nervous system to deceive.
No, you don't. If you want to understand the architecture of human deception, you have to look at the evolutionary precursors. Nature has been selecting for deceptive morphology for millions of years.
Like the orchids. This blew my mind. Can you explain how these plants operate without a brain?
It's incredible. Take the Ophrys genus of orchids. They rely on insect pollination, specifically by male wasps or bees. But instead of offering nectar, like a normal flower, it utilizes deceptive mimicry.
Okay.
The flower's labellum has actually evolved to visually resemble the female of a specific wasp species.
So it looks like a bug.
Yes, but it goes far beyond just visual morphology. The orchid actually synthesizes a highly complex chemical cocktail. It secretes the exact alkenes and alkenes found in the virgin female wasp's sex pheromones.
Wait, really? It is engaging in chemical deception.
Completely.
Hey.
It is hijacking the male wasp's olfactory receptors.
That is wild.
The male wasp is drawn in, attempts to mate with the flower, a process biologists call pseudocopulation, and in doing so, the wasp picks up the orchid's pollen.
Wow.
The orchid has achieved a highly complex, phenomenally successful deception, driven entirely by evolutionary selection pressures without a single neuron firing.
And we see this in the insect kingdom too, right? With Batesian mimicry.
Yes.
A harmless species of moth evolves the exact coloration and banding patterns of a highly venomous wasp. The moth isn't consciously lying to the predatory bird, its DNA is lying.
Right, the survival strategy is baked right into the genome.
But as we move up the evolutionary ladder to mammals, we start to see the biological hardware for cognitive deception forming.
Yes, and researchers heavily study prairie voles for this.
Voles? Why voles?
Because they exhibit oxytocin-driven social bonding. Oxytocin is a neuropeptide that regulates altruism and attachment.
Okay, but why do voles matter when we are talking about human lying?
Because the complex social structures of voles require an incipient form of what developmental psychologists call theory of mind.
Oh, theory of mind.
Right. To navigate a social hierarchy, an organism must be able to recognize that another entity is distinct from itself, with its own perspective and reactions. The oxytocin receptors in the mammalian brain laid the groundwork for recognizing otherness.
So the biological imperative for deception existed in the orchids and the moths, and the neural hardware for recognizing other minds existed in early mammals?
Exactly.
What happens when you combine those two evolutionary tracks and hand them over to the primate's central nervous system?
You get a species capable of metacognition. Humans take biological deception and add abstract thinking, planning, and working memory.
To illustrate how staggering that biological leap is, let's look at the example from the text about a teenager using a fake ID to get into a club. Think about the sheer cognitive load of that exact moment.
It's immense.
When a teenager hands a piece of altered plastic to a bouncer, they are executing a masterclass in executive functioning. They have to run a predictive simulation of the future, like, okay, the bouncer's going to look at the birth year, and then he might test me by asking my zodiac sign.
They are mapping contingencies based on an alternate reality.
Exactly. And simultaneously, they have to exert total top-down control over their autonomic nervous system.
Right. They have to suppress a spike in cortisol, manage their blink rate, force steady eye contact, all to alter the epistemic state of the bouncer.
It is a cognitive gymnastics routine. It requires thousands of hours of social observation to perfect.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the evolutionary perspective suggests that this is not a side effect of human intelligence. It is a driver of it.
Really? A driver?
Throughout our prehistory, hominids who could successfully deceive, to gain access to scarce resources, to avoid lethal conflict, to secure social status, they had a massive survival advantage.
So those who deceived successfully left more descendants.
Evolution relentlessly rewarded the deceptive. The cognitive hardware required to pull off a complex, multi-layered lie was naturally selected for over hundreds of thousands of years.
We are basically the apex predators of deception, precisely because our ancestors were the best liars.
That is the biological reality. Our brains are highly optimized for manipulating the common ground.
But if this hardware is baked into our DNA, how does it activate? Because a human infant doesn't emerge into the world capable of executing the fake ID scenario.
No, thankfully.
How does a child actually learn to perform these cognitive gymnastics? This leads into the developmental psychology covered in chapters 5, 30, and 34, particularly the research by Victoria Talwar.
Talwar's work is fantastic. It frames lying not as a behavioral regression, but as a crucial developmental milestone.
Really? A milestone?
Yes. When a child tells their first deliberate lie, it is evidence that massive demands are successfully being placed on their executive functioning.
For those who might not be familiar with the neurological terminology, what is executive functioning?
It's essentially the command center of the brain. It handles working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control.
And all three are mandatory for deception.
Absolutely. To lie successfully, a child must first exercise inhibitory control to suppress the truth, which is the default Grecian response.
Okay.
Second, they must use cognitive flexibility to invent a plausible alternative reality that fits the physical evidence.
Right.
And third, they must utilize working memory to hold that false reality in their mind across multiple conversational terms, ensuring they do not contradict themselves.
It requires immense computing power.
It really does. But the true watershed moment, the catalyst that turns the executive functioning toward deception, is the acquisition of theory of mind.
Which we touched on with the voles.
Right, but in human development, it is vastly more complex. Theory of mind, or TOM, is the cognitive realization that other people have internal mental states, like beliefs, intents, desires, and knowledge, that are completely distinct from your own.
So understanding that someone else doesn't know what you know?
Exactly. It's the understanding that your mind is not an objective mirror of reality, but a representational model. And crucially, that other minds can hold incorrect models.
And the text says most children acquire this around age 4.
Generally, yes.
And researchers have this really fascinating way of testing it, known as the false belief task, pioneered by Premack and Woodruff. Let's walk through how this methodology actually proves the presence of theory of mind.
Okay, so the classic iteration is often called the Sally Ann test, or a variation using a familiar container. A researcher brings a child into a room and shows them a box that clearly looks like it holds candy, say a Smarties box.
Okay.
The researcher asks the child what is inside. The child says Smarties.
Naturally.
Then the researcher opens the box and reveals that it actually contains pencils. The researcher then closes the box.
So now the child's internal data set has been updated. The box contains pencils.
Right. Then the researcher introduces a puppet, or another person, who has just entered the room and has never seen the inside of the box. The researcher asks the child, when the puppet looks at this box, what will the puppet think is inside?
Okay. So if you ask a 3-year-old who has not yet developed a theory of mind, what do they answer?
The 3-year-old will confidently answer, pencils.
Because they are incapable of separating their own newly acquired knowledge from the puppet's perspective.
Exactly. They assume the common ground is universal. They lack the representational flexibility to model a false belief in another entity.
But when you run the exact same test with a 4-year-old who has achieved theory of mind, the result shifts dramatically.
It does. The 4-year-old will smile and answer, Smarties.
The 4-year-old understands that the puppet is operating on an outdated, incorrect data set. They recognize the false belief. And the moment a child realizes they can perceive a false belief in someone else's mind, they realize they can create a false belief in someone else's mind.
That is the genesis of human lying.
So what does this all mean for parents?
Well, when a parent catches their 4-year-old standing next to a broken lamp holding a baseball bat, and the child says, the dog broke it, The parent's instinct is usually moral panic.
Right, like, oh no, my kid is a liar.
But from a developmental psychology perspective, the parent should actually be a little proud. They should recognize that their child's prefrontal cortex is functioning perfectly. The executive functioning and theory of mind have officially come online.
That is such a wild reframe. So, if lying is this incredibly taxing cognitive load, if it requires inhibitory control, working memory, and theory of mind, can we physically observe the brain doing the work?
You mean with brain scans?
Yeah. If we put a liar in an fMRI scanner, can we map the deception? This brings us to the holy grail of criminology and neuroscience, covered in chapters 34 and 35, heavily featuring Giorgio Ganes's research.
Yeah, functional magnetic resonance imaging tracks the hemodynamic response, so the blood flow, in the brain. Because active neurons require more oxygen, fMRI allows us to see which regions of the brain are working hardest in real time.
And Ganes mapped the neural pathways of deception.
He did, and the results are profound. When a subject is instructed to lie in the scanner, specific regions light up intensely. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which handles executive control, and the anterior insula, which is involved in autonomic regulation, they show massive spikes in activity.
So producing a lie fundamentally requires more oxygenated blood than telling the truth.
Yes, because you are running dual realities simultaneously.
Yeah.
You're holding the truth and the lie.
However, the handbook details a critical systemic flaw in using fMRI as an infallible lie detector. And it all comes down to an overlap analysis utilizing a database called Neurosynth.
Right. Neurosynth is an automated meta-analysis tool.
Hmm.
It aggregates data from thousands of published fMRI studies. So researchers took the brain regions that Ganes identified as lighting up during deception, and they ran those specific coordinates through the database.
And what did they find?
They discovered the base rate problem. When researchers analyzed the brain down to the voxel level, a voxel is essentially a three-dimensional pixel of brain tissue. They found that the deception-selective voxels are almost entirely shared with other cognitive tasks.
This is the crux of why lie detection, whether it's polygraphs or even fMRI, is so difficult. The exact same voxels in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that demand oxygen when you lie, they also demand oxygen when you are solving a complex math problem.
Or trying to remember a phone number, or simply switching your attention from one task to another.
The brain does not possess a dedicated lie center.
There is no specialized biological organ for deception. The brain merely takes its standard suite of cognitive control tools and runs them in overdrive.
So if you are sitting in an fMRI machine and an interrogator asks you about a crime, your prefrontal cortex might light up because you are carefully constructing a false alibi.
Or it might light up because you are completely innocent, incredibly stressed, and straining your working memory to recall exactly where you were on a random Tuesday 3 months ago.
The scanner cannot differentiate between the cognitive load of malicious deception and the cognitive load of intense, honest recall. Which raises an important question, a statistical paradox, really. If lying requires so much effort, and if our brains are so highly evolved to perform it, why are we so universally terrible at detecting it?
That's the million-dollar question. Statistically, human lie detection ability is hovering right around chance levels. Across countless psychological studies, the average person's ability to identify a lie is between 50 and 54%.
You would be just as accurate flipping a coin.
You really would.
That is deeply unsettling. We are a species of highly optimized deceivers wandering around with broken radar. Why didn't evolution give us better detection software?
Well, the evolutionary arms race between the deceiver and the detector heavily favors the deceiver.
Why is that?
Because the evolutionary advantage of successfully lying, like gaining an immediate resource or avoiding immediate death, provided a much stronger selection pressure than the advantage of perfectly detecting lies. Furthermore, if we evolved perfect lie detection, social cohesion would likely collapse.
Which perfectly transitions our focus, because up to this point, we have treated lying as a weapon.
A selfish tool for survival.
Exactly, a survival of the fittest tool to manipulate the common ground for personal gain. But Part 7 of the handbook forces us to look at the altruistic liar, the pro-social lie, and this mind-bending concept of self-deception in chapters 15, 22, and 29.
Simone Dietz provides a comprehensive breakdown of pro-social lies, what we colloquially call white lies.
Right.
These are falsehoods generated with socially harmless or actively benevolent motives. The classic example is a parent telling a child that their deceased pet has gone to live on a sprawling farm.
Dietz highlights the sociological tension here. Strict moral frameworks argue that every lie, regardless of intent, degrades the overarching institution of trust. But sociologically, polite lies are the friction-reducing oil of human interaction.
Sociologists use face-saving theory to explain this. Politeness often mandates a departure from Grice's maxim of quality to uphold a higher social mandate of cohesion.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure, if a colleague gives a terrible presentation and they ask for your thoughts, saying, oh, it was very engaging rather than it was incoherent is a pro-social lie. You are prioritizing the preservation of their social face and the stability of your ongoing relationship over objective factual accuracy.
Deception, in this context, is an act of empathy.
It is empathy executed through executive functioning.
But the concept in this section that fundamentally alters how you view the human mind is Robert Shriver's evolutionary theory of self-deception. When I processed this theory, it fundamentally reframed everything we've discussed about cognitive load.
That's brilliant.
Why would an organism evolve the capacity to systematically lie to its own internal dataset?
Well, to understand Shriver's theory, we had to synthesize the neuroscience we talked about. We know from the fMRI data that lying is cognitively exhausting.
Right.
It requires the suppression of truth, the management of working memory, and the constant policing of your autonomic nervous system to prevent physical tells, like microexpressions, vocal pitch changes, or sweating.
It is a heavy, observable load.
Shriver posits that self-deception evolved in humans specifically as an offensive strategy. If you can convince your own brain that a falsehood is actually true, you eliminate the cognitive friction.
I was absolutely mind-blown by Shriver's concept. Think about the implications of that for your own interactions. If you successfully lie to yourself, then when you transmit that falsehood to another person, you are no longer consciously lying.
Exactly.
Your medial prefrontal cortex is no longer working in overdrive to suppress the truth, because the truth has been successfully hidden from your own conscious awareness.
By deceiving yourself, you eliminate the physical tells. You do not sweat. Your voice does not waver. You maintain perfect, earnest eye contact because, in that specific moment, you genuinely believe the data you are feeding into the common ground.
We literally lie to ourselves so our brains don't have to work as hard when we lie to someone else. Self-deception evolved to make us the perfect, undetectable deceivers.
We literally fracture our own epistemic reality. We partition our own minds so that our executive functioning doesn't have to carry the weight when we trick our peers.
The ultimate con artist's first mark is always themselves.
And this evolutionary strategy provides a vital psychological buffer too. Interestingly, clinical psychology has observed a phenomenon known as depressive realism.
Depressive realism? What's that?
Individuals suffering from certain types of depression often lack self-deception. They view their own abilities, their social standing, and the world around them with an unvarnished, brutally objective accuracy.
Oh, wow.
A functional human mind requires a baseline layer of self-deception, of optimistic illusion to maintain motivation and mental health.
A little bit of self-delusion is literally the biological prerequisite for happiness.
It really is.
It is staggering to realize how deeply woven deception is into our survival. But as we zoom all the way out to end this deep dive, we have to look at how human civilization reconciles this. We have this deeply ingrained biological and neurological habit, but we are also bound by ethics and history.
Right. And Part 8 of the Handbook, particularly the analyses by Thomas Carson in chapters 36 and 42, explores this exact tension. Philosophy and ethics have waged a centuries-long war against our biological instinct to manipulate the truth.
Carson extensively explores St. Augustine's absolutist view. Augustine argued that lying is unequivocally wrong, without exception, regardless of the consequences. His framework was teleological, based on the inherent purpose of things.
Augustine posited that the divine, natural purpose of human speech is the accurate communication of internal thought.
Okay.
Therefore, using speech to convey a known falsehood is a fundamental perversion of its nature. For Augustine, even the pro-social white lie about the dog on the farm is a moral violation because it corrupts the essential function of language.
Carson contrasts Augustine's rigid absolutism with the utilitarian framework. Utilitarians like John Stuart Mill reject the idea that speech has an immutable divine purpose.
They look at the overall consequences.
Exactly. They evaluate the morality of a lie entirely based on its consequences.
A utilitarian acknowledges that lying is generally harmful because it erodes social trust, which is a massive negative consequence.
Right.
However, if a specific lie prevents a severe harm, like the classic philosophical dilemma of lying to a murderer at your door about the location of their intended victim,
Right. In that case, the utilitarian argues that the lie is not only morally permissible, but morally required.
Yes, the positive consequence of saving a life vastly outweighs the negative consequence of a temporary falsehood.
It is the ultimate clash between the inherent nature of the act and the outcome of the act. And when you scale that clash up from individual ethics to history and politics, it becomes even more complex.
It does. The handbook examines the obligations of historians to the objective truth, contrasted with the strategic half-truths frequently deployed by political leaders throughout history to shape national narratives.
And again, remaining entirely neutral here, the text observes how leaders utilize the mechanisms we discussed, like Marsilli's degradation of certainty or Fallis's strategic omissions, not necessarily to rewrite facts, but to guide the collective common ground of a nation.
And crucially, Chapter 44 highlights that the boundaries of this ethical debate are not universal.
Cross-cultural linguistics reveals that Grace's maxims are flouted differently depending on cultural norms. In highly individualistic cultures, direct truth-telling is often elevated as the supreme virtue.
But in more collectivist cultures, the preservation of social harmony and the avoidance of public shame are prioritized over objective factual accuracy.
So the definition of what constitutes a malicious lie versus a necessary social grace shifts dramatically depending on the cultural operating system.
It really does. We've covered an immense expanse of material today, from Carson's believed false statements to the Bayesian probabilities of fMRI voxels.
So if you could distill the entire Oxford Handbook of lying down to its core thesis, what is the comprehensive summary? What is the ultimate takeaway for our listener?
The synthesis is this. Deception is not a mere glitch or a failure of the human condition. It is a fundamental architectural pillar of it.
Right.
It is woven into our linguistics as we navigate Stalnaker's common ground. It is the driving force of our neurological development, sparking the theory of mind in children. It is deep in our evolutionary history, shared with oxytocin-driven mammals and chemically mimicking orchids. Lying is the shadow cast by the light of truth, and you cannot have the staggering complexity of human society without the requisite capacity for deception.
That is beautifully said. So the next time you find yourself telling a polite white lie about a friend's outfit or withholding information during a negotiation, do not merely view it as a moral lapse. Take a second to appreciate the sheer cognitive horsepower firing in your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
And appreciate the millions of years of evolutionary pressure that fine-tuned your brain to execute that complex manipulation of reality.
It is a biological marvel. But as we conclude, we want to leave you with one final, unmentioned provocation that builds on the fundamental premise of everything we've discussed.
If true deception requires theory of mind, executive function, and a deliberate representational intent to manipulate belief.
It requires an internal data set, a mind.
Precisely. So consider the rapid advancement of artificial intelligence. Large language models frequently generate falsehoods, a phenomenon we call hallucinations.
Right.
But if a machine lacks a true theory of mind, if it has no internal beliefs, no awareness of your epistemic state, and no genuine intent to deceive, can an AI actually lie?
Or is a generative falsehood simply the digital equivalent of an orchid synthesizing a chemical to trick a wasp? Deception driven by algorithms, entirely devoid of a mind, something for you to ponder, deception without a mind, that is a truly haunting concept to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of the untruth. We will see you next time.